Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Alison Curry for our Emerging Scholars talk today. I'll just introduce Alison very briefly, and then she'll talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have about 10 minutes of time for questions. So Alison Curry is an advanced doctoral student at UNC, and she is completing her dissertation right now as a fellow with the Association for Jewish Studies. Previously, she was a Saul Kagan Fellow in Advanced Shoah Studies from the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany. She's also received a number of other fellowships and grants, including from the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies, for whose support our doctoral students and I am grateful. Her innovative dissertation bridges pre-war and wartime histories and approaches the wartime period from both perpetrator and victim perspectives, drawing on a wide range of sources in Polish and Yiddish. And in fact, an article that she has written based on her dissertation research will be coming out very soon in the journal Polin, Studies in Polish Jewry, which is the premier journal in the field. So her dissertation is titled In the Space of the Dead, Tradition, Identity, and Everyday Life in the Jewish Cemeteries of Poland, 1918 to 1945. And today she will talk about one part of that research in a talk titled From Burial Society to Funeral Home, Rupture and Continuity in Communal Care for the Jewish Deceased in the Polish Lands, 1918 to 1945. So I will turn this over to you, Alison.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you to the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies for having me today. In November 1941, Abraham Mordechai Rogove wrote a letter in which he hoped will be published in Gazeta Żydowska, the official newspaper for ghettos and the general government. In this letter, Rogove called for the creation of a hevrah kadisha, or a burial society in the Warsaw Ghetto, composed of, quote, honorable and more honest citizens who would watch over the proper burying of corpses in accordance with principles of human and religious ethics, unquote. So the question we start with today is, why would Rogove feel the need to appeal for a burial society in Warsaw in November 1941? To understand what spurred Rogove's letter, we must explore the roots of the burial society in the Polish lands, and particularly the many changes to these organizations that took place in the 2 decades leading up to the Second World War. The hevrah kadisha, directly translated as Holy Society, but more commonly known in the English language as the Burial Society, was a central institution of Jewish communal life since at least the 16th century in Eastern Europe, responsible for establishing and administering burial grounds, securing the care of the seriously ill and dying, preparing the deceased for burial, and the burial and funeral itself. Traditionally, the Burial Society and its members were held in singularly high regard amongst the Jewish community. A former resident of the town of Sochaczew in Poland recalled that it was actually quite difficult to become a member of the Burial Society. Quote, one had to have great moral virtues and a good reputation. They were very special people. The fate of every deceased person was in their hands, unquote. The Burial Society was intended to serve the community, providing free burials for even the poorest community members who often could not afford proper funerals for their loved ones. In most cases, a member of a burial society would have to pay an annual low fee, which asserted their own membership status, but also aided in the burial of those who could not otherwise afford it. Membership fees and cemetery taxes, which were usually collected by the Burial Society, were central to the Jewish community's economic and financial well-being overall. The financial centrality of the Burial Society within the Jewish community lent itself towards critiques of corruption and embezzlement, which became more and more common in the early 20th century. And now I have many, many examples of this, but for the sake of time, I'll share just one with you. In the town of Biała Polacka, a son believed that his mother had prepaid the hevrah kadisha for her own funeral before her death. And so after she died, he approached the Burial Society, or a member of the Burial Society, to ask about her funeral arrangements. And this member informed the son that though she had indeed purchased a plot, she had paid a very small amount, enough only for a, quote, standing or upright burial. So ultimately, the son was forced to pay an additional fee for a proper lying burial, as he wanted his mother buried, quote, like all Jews, unquote. Due to these frequent complaints of corruption within the Burial Society, Jews began to form new voluntary burial organizations during the early 20th century. And though most of the organizations would be established during the interwar period, The first documented of these was established in Warsaw in 1908. These had often the same sort of name. You see one on your screen now, Ostatnia Posługa, which is Polish for the last service, or Chesed Shel Emes, which means the grace of truth, or other similar iterations of these names were utilized. These were reimaginations of the traditional burial society, and these arose across Poland, often in response to such concerns over corruption. These organizations took on much of the same responsibilities of the traditional burial societies of the past, but through reorganization, written charters, delineations of rules, and the establishment of formal committees, they attempted to ensure that similar charges of corruption or abuse would not be leveled against them. A call to action leaflet posted in the city of Lublin in the early 1920s informed the community that with the permission of a local rabbi, a new burial society was to be formed in that city. Now, a hevrah kadisha had once existed in Lublin. The leaflet claimed that it had been abolished a long time ago for some reason, but that, quote, the necessity of this society is always present, unquote. So in 1924, a new burial organization was finally established in Lublin, formally named Ostatnia Posługa Chesed Shel Emes. Established by a group of Orthodox Jews in the town, the association drew up a formal charter to outline their duties and goals. In this charter, Ostatnia Posługa in Lublin aimed to, quote, make sure that all religious rites prescribed by Jewish ritual are carried out with corpses of Jewish deceased, and that someone is constantly watching over the corpses, that all legal formalities with sanitary, administrative, and other authorities are fulfilled in due time, and if necessary, that is, to the poor at the expense of the society, and that everything necessary be taken for the early and decent burial of Jewish deceased, both those who died as a result of disease in private homes, hospitals, asylums, establishments, as well as victims of unfortunate accidents, and the society strictly adheres to the laws and statutes of these cases, unquote. The Charter of Ostatnia Posługa in Lublin highlights the centrality of maintaining Jewish ritual within their duties and also avoiding charges of corruption. Not only did these associations maintain formal elections and membership processes, but they also established audit committees that regularly tracked their incoming profits and outgoing expenses. However, the measures put in place to avoid the issues of corruption and abuses that befell the hevrah kadisha of the past did not do much to dissuade members from fraudulent behaviors within these new societies. And the most prominent such case during the interwar period was those of the trials and accusations against Mordechai Model Pinkyurt during the mid to late 1930s in Warsaw. So Pinkyurt had worked for Warsaw's Ostatnia Posługa Chesed Shel Emes since 1915, even serving as its manager for many years. But by the early 1930s, state prosecutors began to investigate Pinkyrt's practices in relation to this burial organization. And in a spectacular and highly publicized trial in September 1937, Pinkyrt, along with other members of Chesed Shel Emes, medical examiners, and gravediggers, were all formally accused of embezzlement. Now, specifically, the trial accused Pinkyrt of embezzling 50,000 zloty while serving as a member of Ostatnia Posługa, as well as falsifying death certificates, charging the Jewish community for burial garments but never providing them, and overcharging families for the transportation of their loved one's body to the cemetery. Now, Pinkyrt tried to defend his actions while working as a manager of Ostatnia Posługa. He admitted to making mistakes on paperwork and death certificates, but he did not confess to intentional forgeries on these documents. Regarding his own wealth, which prosecutors argued was due to embezzlement, Pinkyrt instead offered that he made a salary from his own private business, which earned him large sums of money. Now, after an initial stint in prison in the early 1930s, Ostatnia Posługa did not allow Pinkyrt to return to work for them, and so instead, in 1935, he opened his own funeral office, Wieczność, or Eternity, which was likely the first private Jewish funeral office in Poland. While his funeral office would still provide free services to the poor, it would charge the wealthy for their burial services. This was the beginning of the privatization of the Jewish funeral industry in Poland, a step that would have lasting consequences for the Jewish community of Warsaw, particularly during the Second World War, as we will get to. So, despite his attempts to defend his actions during this lengthy trial in 1937, Pinkyrt and his co-conspirators were convicted of embezzlement. Pinkyrt received the longest sentence of 3.5 years in prison, and Ostatnia Posługa of Warsaw continued to function after Pinkyrt's initial arrest, but his actions had a lasting impact on this organization. Throughout 1935, multiple financial appeals were made to the Jewish community in Warsaw on behalf of Ostatnia Posługa, asking the community to contribute to its cause, both by becoming members and through financial donations. One appeal from November 35, which you see on your screen, claimed, quote, unfortunately, various circumstances and, most importantly, undesirable work methods have in recent years deprived the society of its luster as a social institution, unquote. The success of these financial appeals is unknown. It's likely that the original Ostatnia Posługa struggled to overcome its financial losses, especially when it was in direct competition with Pinkiert's funeral business that he established after his initial arrest. Ostatnia Posługa seemed to have existed until at least 1938, as advertisements for its services appeared in the official newspaper for the Jewish community until then. Now, when the Second World War began, it would be the leaders of the burial societies that existed during the interwar period that were forced into the management and decision-making concerning the burial of the dead, which would unfortunately involve more burials than these communities had ever seen before. In some towns, those that had institutional knowledge of burial practice and procedure were from the traditional burial society, the hevrah kadisha, which often meant that these individuals were older and more well-established within their towns. And others, they were the reformers, the leaders of this new type of burial society formed in the early decades of the 20th century. And these changes had a lasting impact. For example, in the town of Piotrków-Trybunalski, during the invasion of Nazi Germany, the wealthiest members of the community left town at the first signs of onslaught, which included most of the town's hevrah kadisha. Because of this, when the initial fighting was over and corpses lay strewn in the street and, quote, accumulated in the gutters, unquote, there were no members of the pre-war burial society in town to take care of their burial. So the only person remaining who could assist with the burial of the deceased was a grave digger. He actually had to call on help from the rabbi and other Jews that were in the town to help him bury the scores of dead. Now, there's almost zero documentation on Warsaw's Ostatnia Posługa for the first year of the war. But during that time, we know that most burial procedure was taken over completely by the Jewish Council in Warsaw. Chaim Kaplan provides a little clarity in his diary, in an entry from October 9th, 1941, in which he wrote, quote, death in the ghetto has become big business, which brings great profits. In normal times, burial was in the hands of the Jewish community, undertaken by the Judenrat, while special cases were handled by Chesed Shel Emes, which acted as an auxiliary of the Judenrat. Not so now, unquote. So just a month after the start of the Second World War, a Jewish council was established in Warsaw, which divided its authority into several departments, one of which was a cemetery department. And the cemetery department in Warsaw was initially led by a man named Meshulam Kamener, a member of Orthodox political activist groups, and who had served as a board member on the pre-war Jewish Community Council to oversee cemetery affairs. So he was very well known in the world of the cemetery before the war. What we know is that for the first year of German occupation in Warsaw, up until the establishment of the ghetto in October 1940, the cemetery department of the Judenrat, or the Jewish Council, oversaw care and maintenance of Warsaw's Jewish cemeteries and the overall burial process, and may have been utilizing Ostatnia Posługa, Chesed Shel Emes, to assist with the burial of the poor. It does seem as though this partnership ended at some point in this first year, however. And by October 1940, just before the establishment of the ghetto, new businesses had been established in Warsaw that would try to take advantage of the increasing death rates in the city. 3 advertisements for burial institutions ran in Gazeta Żydowska on October 2nd, 1940. The first of these was likely a continuation of Ostatnia Posługa, as it claims itself to be the first Jewish funeral institution. Unquote. Additionally, the directors of this funeral home, Itzhak Isaacson and Noach Pinkiert, who is the brother of Mordechai Pinkiert, had previously served in the pre-war burial society. However, now in October 1940, they're advertising their own burial service that, quote, arranges funerals, carries out exhumations, and transport corpses in its own hearses, unquote, this time for a fee. The second called itself Ostatnia Droga, the Last Way, and was under the direction of Natan Wittenberg, another member of the pre-war burial society Ostatnia Posługa. And finally, the third institution, Wieczność, ran the largest of the 3 advertisements. Wieczność claimed that all its funerals were carried out quickly, punctually, and cheaply, while also having, quote, a great selection of metal, oak, mahogany, and pine coffins in stock, unquote. This final funeral home was under the direction of Mordechai Pinkiert. And certainly, these organizations were established to profit from death. Those in the newly formed ghetto who had still had some amount of wealth and wanted to retain proper Jewish burials turned to the funeral homes when a loved one died. But these institutions also advertised themselves as serving the poor of the ghetto in addition to these other services. The advertisement for Ostatnia Droga claimed, quote, for the poorest, far-reaching relief, unquote, while Wieczność asserted that, quote, funerals are arranged free of charge for the poor, unquote. However, such claims would be impossible for them to maintain. The establishment of privatized funeral institutions irrevocably changed burial processes for Jews in Warsaw. On top of that, the establishment of the ghetto later that month would also impact issues over burial, as one of Warsaw's Jewish cemeteries would be excluded from ghetto boundaries, putting all of the pressure of burial on just one space. Around the same time as space for Jewish burial was decreased, death rates were increasing. By January 1941, the Jewish Council estimated that weekly funeral rates were double what they were before the war. Jews in the ghetto noted the increase in deaths as well. One report from the Warsaw Ghetto wrote that, quote, Black Jewish hearses have become a factor of the everyday street scene, unquote. In the Warsaw Ghetto, funeral processions to the cemetery were uninterrupted, while piles of bodies filled the mortuaries at both the hospitals and the cemetery. Jews who were able to retain some of their wealth during the war were often able to afford funerals that looked much like the funerals of the pre-war period. Through hiring one of the ghetto's many funeral homes, families could pay for individualized services, elaborate gravestones, and religious officiants to recite graveside prayers. While some Jews could provide lavish funerals for their loved ones, the poor were relegated to mass graves, often without coffins or shrouds. Emanuel Ringelblum wrote about the disparity in burials in his journal from the Warsaw Ghetto on March 18, 1941, quote, the corpses are laid in mass graves separated from each other by boards. Most of the dead brought to the graveyard from the hospital are buried naked. In the house I lived in, a father, mother, and son all died from hunger in one day. Pinkyert, king of the dead, keeps opening new branches of his funeral parlors. He recently opened a branch on Smoshna Street where he offers a luxury funeral, i.e. for 12 zloty, you can have pallbearers in a special uniform, unquote. The funeral institutions made an indelible mark on everyday life in the ghetto, particularly those of the Pinkyert brothers. A doctor in the Warsaw Ghetto, Edward Reicher, wrote in his memoir that, quote, there may have been no bigger funeral business in the history of mankind than that of Mr. Pinkyert, who believed that by burying others, he would escape being buried himself, unquote. Beyond just describing the ownership of funeral carts and hearses and staff with the Pinkyert brothers' funeral homes, the Pinkyert name ultimately became synonymous with death. And I don't have time to explore this further in my talk, but I'd be happy to share more of this in the Q&A if folks are curious. By early 1941, Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto began to consistently articulate concerns over the treatment of Jewish corpses and the lack of care surrounding burial practices. On March 13, 1941, Kaplan wrote in his diary that as the funeral wagon goes by, quote, no one turns to watch it or pays any attention to the fact that in the coffin, which goes by at such a clip, lies one of the victims of starvation. Sometimes several corpses are placed in one coffin, one on top of the other, and all are taken for burial at one time, a wholesale business, unquote. So when Rogove wrote his letter in November 1941, he was writing in response to many of the changes that had occurred within the Jewish burial sphere in Warsaw. But an additional blow was the death of Meshulam Kaminer in October 1941, just 1 month prior to Rogove's letter. According to Rogove, Kaminer's death was, quote, an irreparable loss to the ghetto, unquote, as he worked diligently to care for the dead and the cemetery during his tenure as the chair of the cemetery department. In Rogove's letter, he detailed the collapse of the burial system in the short time after Kaminer's death. For Rogove, the treatment of the dead in the ghetto was, quote, at the highest level of social amorality, unquote. His letter called on Jewish law, writing that, quote, in the authoritative books of Judaism is clearly written that the consequence of the sin of defiling a corpse is an epidemic. Please remember, even for defiling one single corpse, unquote. He lists specific ways in which the dead were being mistreated. First, he called the burial of the dead in mass graves sadistic. He criticized how the dead were often robbed of their clothing and dumped into the mass grave naked. At the cemetery, the mortuary was full of dead bodies laying naked, one on top of another. He also critiqued how body collectors, whose only mission was to fill their carts, carried men's and women's bodies together. For Rogove, the entire process of burial as it existed in the Warsaw Ghetto was unjustifiable. He believed that the solution to this problem was to reestablish the traditional hevrah kadisha in Warsaw. In the letter you see on your screen, Rogove included supporting letters from various members of the community who agreed to volunteer their efforts in establishing a burial society in the Warsaw Ghetto. One supporter wrote that a group of ghetto inhabitants led by a rabbi met and decided to, quote, devote ourselves voluntarily to caring for the burying of corpses. On behalf of this group of citizens, I appeal to the leaders of the funeral department to make every effort to implement the thoughts expressed by Mr. Rogove and relieve the Jewish community from a grave shame," unquote. Concerns over the burial of the poor were formally brought to the Jewish Council in spring 1942. In a letter written to the Jewish Council chair, Chernyakov, a group of religious Jews described the state of Jewish burials in the ghetto as such, quote, "In a very short period of time, the basic rules of ethics and tradition in relation to a deceased Jew, which have been practiced by the people of Israel for thousands of years, have been broken," unquote. And particularly, this letter described the treatment of the deceased as so mediocre that, quote, "Death does not free him from the difficulty of life anymore, but the moment he dies and the tragedy of his life comes to an end, the tragedy of his death begins," unquote. This letter advocated for the creation of a group called the Benevolent Association for the Burial of the Dead, which would assist the poor of the ghetto with funeral preparations and transportation of bodies to the cemetery. Now, an article from Gazeta Żydowska details the creation of such a society in April 1942, reporting that Patronage Association members are present at burials, and their presence undoubtedly ensures a closer observance of the prescribed rituals, and in general stated that conditions of burial have considerably improved. But just a few months later, mass deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto began, and these efforts were inevitably halted. The privatization of the funeral industry in Warsaw became a defining characteristic of that ghetto. Though a cadre of Warsaw's pre-war funerary leaders took advantage of ghetto conditions to run funerary businesses, Mordechai Pinkier was certainly the most infamous. His actions during the war led ghetto inhabitants to criticism and admonishment, while other funerary business owners were relatively forgotten. The Pinkier name became synonymous with death, and the many changes to burial processes led to calls for returns to traditional burial institutions in the ghetto. In Warsaw, the largest ghetto in occupied Europe, the burial of the dead grew into an overwhelming process that none of the institutions that oversaw it could handle. Funerary leaders and institutions became a central means through which ghetto inhabitants articulated their perceptions over power inequalities in the ghetto. The success of these institutions and actors was ultimately rooted in the continuance of death, a reality that ghetto inhabitants observed acutely and criticized profusely. Now, Pinkier would survive until at least 1943, though the manner of his death is disputed. Some say he died at Treblinka, the death camp to which most of Warsaw's Jews were deported and ultimately killed. But other reports say that he escaped after the ghetto uprising to the forest and died fighting with the partisans. Now, the burial society, as it was known long before the war, came to an end after this, along with so many of the individuals that comprised them. But a focus on the actors and institutions surrounding Jewish burial practices demonstrates the need for studies that cross traditional lines of scholarly periodization. To understand what happened during the Holocaust, we must also examine the periods prior. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Alison, for that really fascinating talk. Those of you who would like to ask a question, you can type a question into the Q&A function of the webinar. In the meantime, Alison, I'll just ask you a brief question to get started until I see some questions posted here. So what I find really fascinating is this tension between the dehumanization that you describe, including through the Pinkier brothers' actions, right? But also the attempt to maintain some kind of dignity and humanity simply in having a funeral or having some kind of attempt at ritual practice. Could you comment on that tension?
Sure. I think this is in my dissertation, I organized this very differently. So this presentation is actually me putting together information from different chapters. So how I actually discuss this is different, and I actually focus more on ritual and what ritual meant in the dissertation. And approaching it through ritual, I think, pulls out a little bit more of what you're pointing out here. Because I argue that this is there are some pendulum swings happening with how Jews related to their ritual traditions, and that here we really see that Jews were really yearning through what they saw in the treatment of the dead and the dehumanization that you mentioned. They were really yearning for these returns to traditional burial practices that we see that most Jewish communities kind of they move away from slightly during the interwar period. So the returns of the traditional hevrah kadisha, the returns to maintaining individual burials and making sure we have shrouds and the care for the deceased. Rogovy's, more of his letter, he really is upset about the treatment of women's bodies specifically, which is something that I really don't see anyone else speak about in quite this way. But it's such a compelling, difference in how individuals are thinking about this. But he's so horrified by the treatment of women's bodies specifically in this. So I think it's what's so fascinating to me is the difference in that through how the dead are treated, really ritual and living ritual and the performance of ritual becomes so much more important. Hopefully that answers your question a little bit. Oh, sorry, you're muted.
I don't see any questions yet, so please feel free to enter.
I do see one in the chat now.
Do you?
Yeah.
Oh, in the chat. Okay,
Yes,
I'm
yeah.
looking at the Q&A. Okay, great. I will read these questions in 1 minute. Okay. Let's see. Okay, I think I can see this. So this is from Vivian Fisher, and she writes, can you comment on the practices of the hevrah during that time compared to the modern hevrah rituals we have in the United States today? And she added, I'd be interested to hear more about the ritual practices themselves.
Sure. I mean, from what I know of contemporary hevrah rituals, they're pretty similar to the ones of the past. The hevrah kadisha of interwar Poland or early 20th century Poland, they were performing tahara on bodies, right? So they were performing the ritual washing of bodies and the ritual purification of bodies. They were maintaining gender divisions of this, which is something that a lot of contemporary hevrah kadisha continue to do in the US today. Now, the main difference that I would assume it might be case dependent, but would be really in who manages the cemetery. That I'm less sure of, but in many of the towns in early 20th century Poland, the burial society had a lot of control over the cemetery, and they would pick the plot and they would assure that the burial plot was, who would receive which burial plot in the cemetery. Being very involved in that part of the process. And I'm not quite sure how involved the burial society is with that today. The hevrah kadisha of the past also would do things like the ritual guarding of the body until burial. The practice of shmirah. This is one practice that I see come up in sources that I think is fascinating. I am not as sure if this is one that is continued today, but so some of these I think are still continued as much as possible. I hope I answered your question, Vivian.
Okay, we have another question from Colleen Newhart, who wrote, you mentioned that Pinkert's funeral home wasn't the only institution conducting Jewish burials in the ghetto, but that it became the main focus. Could you talk more about the other institutions that existed in the for-profit scheme?
So this would be Ostatnia Droga, this would be Ostatnia Posługa, and these we really we don't have a lot of documentation on what happens with these. We have a couple more advertisements for them in Gazeta Żydowska through the next year after October 1940. So sometime in 1941, there's one more advertisement for Ostatnia Posługa. And we really don't have formal documentation of these societies after that. And really what we hear about them comes from survivors from the ghetto or from memoirs or testimonies. And so it's really fascinating. This is, I think, why the Pinkyard name has really stuck out. It's why we hear mostly about Pinkyard and why they're really, when people talk about Pinkyard, they're mostly talking about Mordechai, but there's also his brother was involved in a lot of this. Sometimes they say the Pinkyard brothers, but Noach had his own funeral home, and there's not really much division in survivor testimonies between which funeral home they're speaking about. And so I think the Pinkyard name becomes kind of a symbol of all of the funeral homes in the ghetto. We can see there's in some photographs, you can see if they're the photographs of the hearses, for example, You can see the different names on some of the hearses. There's some photographs that some German soldiers took as they were kind of touring Warsaw, unfortunately, but there are some pictures that they take of the fronts of the funeral offices. So we have some pictures of that. But that's really where we get information from. So it's really unfortunate. We don't have we don't have any of their own documentation, but it's really from survivors, from memoirs, from the underground archive that existed in Warsaw. And I think this is why the Pinkyard name really stuck out. And I think it became kind of synonymous for all of the funeral homes that ended up existing. Thanks, Colleen.
Okay, great. If no one has another question, we have time perhaps for one more question, but I don't see another one. So let's see. Okay, Alison, thank you so much for sharing your really important research. I didn't introduce myself at the beginning, so I'll just say I'm Karen Auerbach. I'm a faculty member in the Department of History and Carolina Center for Jewish Studies. I also want to thank Paul Bonici from the Carolina Public Humanities for helping us organizing the technology. And on behalf of the center, I thank you all for coming. We have a full slate of events this semester, and so please see on the chat function. Oh, I think Paul has just, or Karen has just posted the slate of events we have this semester, and you can also go to our website, which Karen posted in the chat of Zoom. So thank you all for coming today, and thank you, Alison.
Thanks, everyone.